Hello and welcome to the southeast corner of Chichester Cathedral, where we are delighted this evening to be celebrating the 60th anniversary of the unveiling of this magnificent piece behind me, Graham Sutherland's Noli made Tangere. And it's my great delight to welcome back really, a great friend of the cathedral and a great advisor whose wisdom we benefit from hugely, Simon Martin, who's the director of the Pallant Gallery. Simon, it's great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Are there any housekeeping? We haven't, this is the first live one we've done.
We probably need to do a little bit of housekeeping, which is just to say that if you're watching at home, your camera is switched off, your mic is switched off, and if you have any questions, there is an opportunity to put those questions at the bottom, and we will be answering at the end of the talk. We are hoping to go through some of those questions that come through this evening.
Great. We look forward to those. Well, it's exciting to be in this chapel in particular because we're thinking a little bit about Dean Walter Hussey, who is so important in the story of this particular painting. And we've just discovered, or something I probably should have known about already, that Walter Hussey is in fact immured, which is, if a word you're not aware of, means is Walter Hussey's ashes are within the wall behind me. You can't quite see his memorial tablet. But this chapel here, the St. Mary Magdalene Chapel, is one of his greatest contributions to the cathedral, alongside the Chagall window and the Piper tapestry. And I wondered, just to kick things off, Simon, whether you could tell us a little bit more about Walter Hussey, because of course he's very important for the gallery's own foundation.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And of course, Walter Hussey was the Dean of Chichester Cathedral from 1955 to 1977. And the close relationship really between the cathedral and Pallant House Gallery, which is just a few minutes walk away, is largely because Walter Hussey, when he retired, he offered his collection, his own art collection, which really spanned from etchings by Rembrandt right the way through to modern British art artists like Frank Auerbach, ceramics by Lucy Ree and various others. And he said that he would leave his collection to the city of Chichester if Pallant House, which was then council offices, was converted into a museum. And so this is what happened at the end of the 1970s and the early 80s. Pallant House was restored from being council offices and opened in 1982. So next year is our 40th anniversary. And then of course, Walter Hussey died in 1985, and his collection became permanently part of the gallery's holdings. And of course, a lot of the modern art that he commissioned in Chichester Cathedral, we have related works and studies. And of course, in relation to this work, we have a related painting, which of course we'll see this evening.
Great. I mean, I suppose, is it worth reflecting upon what this chapel would have looked like, I suppose, when Hussey arrived? I mean, embarking upon a refurbishment of a chapel like this, which I think you said was just panels, effectively.
So originally, when Hussey arrived, in 1955, this chapel apparently had dry rot, and it was panelled, I think it was Victorian panelling with a series of scenes of the life of St. Richard. And of course, as you'll know, that this chapel had a relationship with both St. Richard and St. Mary Magdalene, and St. Richard, of course, being patron saint of the cathedral. Apparently his head was kept just behind where I'm sitting here at one point. And so there was that relationship.
And a debate around how artistic contributions to this chapel, whether they'd be towards Richard or to Mary Magdalene.
Absolutely,
right? Yeah. So in terms of well, it's one thing refurbishing a chapel, I guess, in the late 1950s, but to then invite one of Britain's leading artists to contribute a piece, was that particularly unusual at that point? I mean,
yes, and I think one of the things about Walter Hussey, he's often described as the greatest patron of the arts in the 20th century in the church, and of course at the time he was doing kind of initiating the kinds of commissions that he did in Chichester, which of course also include John Piper's tapestry on the high altar. There's also the Chagall window that he commissioned, as well as wonderful music. So Leonard Bernstein's Chichester Psalms, of course. So but he already had form in his previous post as Vicar of St Matthew's, Northampton. He, of course, had commissioned Henry Moore to do the extraordinary Madonna and Child. Benjamin Britten had written music, as had others. And then, of course, Graham Sutherland as well. So in 1945, Graham Sutherland had been commissioned. And I wonder whether we should perhaps look through some of these images. And
how did he know Sutherland?
So he met Sutherland. So the starting point really was the fact that during the Second World War, Chelsea School of Art was moved, due to the Blitz, was moved to Northampton. And so he got to know Henry Moore. And he, through Henry Moore and other art tutors being there, he then commissioned the Madonna and Child. And then through Kenneth Clark, who became involved with that important commission for the Madonna and Child, he was seeing exhibitions at the National Gallery during the Second World War of the official war artists, and Graham Sutherland was one of the official war artists. And I think the introduction came through, I'm not quite sure whether it was Kenneth Clark or Henry Moore, and of course the other key figure involved with that was John Piper, who also, and they all went up for the unveiling of...
Neo-Romantics.
Yes, yeah. And they all went up to Northampton for the unveiling of Henry Moore's Madonna and Child. So he got to meet these individuals. So perhaps in terms of the slideshow, it's good to see both the work we have behind us, Noli Me Tangere, 1961, altarpiece by Graham Sutherland, and the related painting. We call it Christ Appearing to Mary Magdalene, a slightly more prosaic title at the gallery, but it's, we'll come on to why there are two versions a bit later in the talk. But here is an image of Walter Hussey in the deanery, and you can actually see one of his collections of Henry Moore's on the wall, on the bookshelf behind him. And also to give a sense of the artist that we're talking about, Graham Sutherland, who was born in 1903. And this is a photograph of him in 1962, just a year after this painting was commissioned. And so, as I mentioned, in 1945, Walter Hussey had commissioned Graham Sutherland to create a painting for his church. And I think what's rather interesting is that he initially approached him asking him to paint an agony in the garden. And I think partly the reason for this was because he knew that Sutherland was known for his landscape paintings, and particularly during the 1930s and 40s, he had been painting views of Pembrokeshire and Wales, and so was known for these very neo-romantic landscapes. And I guess Hussey was thinking that actually an altarpiece with a view of the landscape was a perfect kind of commission, but actually what Sutherland said was actually he wanted to paint a crucifixion, and he'd recently, as a war artist, he'd been sent photographs of Bergen-Belsen, the concentration camp, and seen these horrific photographs of contorted bodies and what have you. So it's interesting that in Hussey's mind, that idea of the agony in the garden was already there. But what Sutherland was doing at that point in time was thinking about images of suffering, but relating them to nature and the idea of the thorn tree. And one of the other works that Hussey acquired in his collection was this painting of thorn trees. And these series of images of trees in Kent, where he was living, led on to these extraordinary thorn heads. And this thorn head here is a kind of, it's the idea of a crucified head, nature and an image of Christ coming together.
When's that, Simon?
So this is 1945.
Okay, it's quite similar colours, aren't they?
It is absolutely, and and I think that is something which is very interesting about how, what Hussey, just down the path, down here, of course, later living in the deanery, and also in his collection, the 1947 crucifixion, his own version of that picture, of the crucifixion that he had. And separately from Hussey, Sutherland himself being, he was actually a practicing Catholic. But
he converted because of his wife, was that right? But he was faithful.
Yes,
in that
yeah,
sense,
and he was a man of conviction and faith. And so I think this is very interesting how in the post-war years, he moves into two things which he hadn't done previously, one of which was portraiture. And perhaps the most famous is the portrait, one of Somerset Maugham, but secondly, Winston Churchill, which of course,
from the Crown.
Everyone that's watched The Crown will have seen that it got destroyed. We do actually, in the collection of Pallant House Gallery, have a study for his hand, which probably we should get
That's
out
on display. Yes, we should. You get the Crown fans flocking to see Churchill's hand.
But one of the key commissions that came out of this, and actually Sutherland also painted a deposition, which is in the Methodist art collection and others, was Coventry Cathedral. And of course, Coventry Cathedral was built out of the ruins of the bombed cathedral, and designed by Basil Spence, who was a friend of Walter Hussey, and he came to Chichester. And of course, an entirely modernist cathedral. And Sutherland designed the tapestry at Aubusson. It was made in the same place as where the Piper tapestry was made a few years later, but of Christ in glory with the tetramorphs. And interestingly, at the base of the tapestry is a crucifixion, which again relates, it's directly related to the crucifixion commissioned by Walter Hussey.
Just seeing his crucifixion, I am reminded of Francis Bacon's works, where a man not of faith, I think it's fair to say, where the contortion is really taken to a different level, isn't it?
Yeah.
And pain and agony arising out of the war, the Holocaust, really comes to the fore. In fact, it was something which the bishop often brings up, saying, why are there no images of suffering in this cathedral? We don't have a cross with anywhere a symbol of Christ's suffering. And it's interesting that when we come to 1961, actually we're looking to the resurrection and to quite a different scene from the Bible rather than pain and agony. What was the conversations which kind of led to this commission?
It's very interesting how in Hussey's own collection, of course, he's previously commissioned the crucifixion in St. Matthew's, Northampton. He has his own crucifixion. In terms of the historic religious works that he acquired, Hussey seemed to be very interested in the theme of the flight into Egypt. And so there's a Rembrandt of the flight into Egypt in the collection of Pallant House Gallery. There's a couple of Tiepolos. And so there are certain things that he obviously is interested in theologically. But as you say, nothing that most of the work that he commissioned is joyous. You think of the Chagall, the John Piper, for example, and an image of the resurrection, which is very unusual in the history of art.
Right. Yeah, and I suppose I was trying to think of other scenes, which I guess we'll come on to later. But I think I was even just talking to some tourists this week, saying how much they love the cathedral because they feel its warmth and it feels homely. And I think, as you come through the west doors, your eyes are drawn to the Piper tapestry, and that's the warmth of the colour there, the high altar. But it was also, I think, the effect of Hussey with this chapel is that you've got this fantastic view all the way down to the baptistry. And when you stand there and you're perhaps pondering your death in Christ, you look up and see this little fire on the horizon, which kind of captures, I suppose, the resurrection faith quite beautifully. But it is very intelligent in terms of how the building invites
one of the things I think Hussey, in his first years in Chichester, There are letters which are now in the records office with John Piper comes to visit, and there's one letter where he writes to Hussey, and Hussey has obviously been asking him things about what could be improved, and John Piper writes to him and says, I'm sorry I've behaved rather like a crabby tourist. So he's obviously been saying various things, but also Basil Spence, who of course was the architect of Coventry Cathedral, visited, and he described this view that you've just mentioned as one of the, I think he said, the most glorious views in Europe.
Gosh.
And I think in a lot of cathedrals, of course, you'll have huge long expanses, but not from one end of the building to the other. There's normally a curve or something that stops you having that connection.
And actually, it's particularly interesting that I don't know, you have to advise me whether they were here at this point, but you walk up from your baptism and you reach this turning point, which is the Lazarus reliefs, these amazing 12th century sculptures, which is a turning point of the gospel, the resurrection of Lazarus in John's gospel, and then directed to the Easter Garden.
Of course, the font that's there now by John Skelton was actually installed after Hussey. So I guess, I'm not quite sure, I think...
Is the font definitely there? Or
I think there was actually a font in a slightly different position.
Okay.
And the baptistry was then created with the Fibush mural, which is now looks all the way down the aisle, was moved to one side.
Yeah. Sorry, I interrupted your explanation of Sutherland. And yeah. I mean, is it worth sort of spending a bit of time looking at the painting itself and pondering its subject matter and perhaps thinking about how Sutherland composed it in the way that he did. I mean, we talked about the colours. Do you want to expand upon that a bit? What are they?
Well, one of the things about the colour scheme that Sutherland uses, it's very, it's bright, it's bold, but it's also largely dominated by two colours, these complementary kind of turquoise green and the orangey red, these complementary colours. And I think partly that's because he's aware that it's got to be seen from a long way away. But I guess, and you can say a lot more about the subject matter, and I feel I should defer to you in terms of talking about the kind of theological reading of that. But I guess the fundamental thing about this work is it's about human contact, but the contact is only through the eyes, and this idea of not touching, which of course is, as we sit here talking to each other kind of a couple of meters apart over Zoom, is very kind of, it's kind of potent idea, really.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, I think, I mean, the title obviously, perhaps we didn't say at the beginning, means, do not touch me in Latin, or better, do not cling on to me. And these are the words which Jesus says to Mary Magdalene, who is the first to see the risen Jesus. This is a scene from chapter 20 of John's Gospel. And it's an extraordinary moment, really, because you've got this moment of recognition, but that's preceded by this moment of mistaken identity, where Mary thinks she sees the gardener, which is sort of immensely charming, really, in its sort of personal detail brought in. And she asks him, where have you laid the body, having encountered the empty tomb? And it's not until Jesus says to her, Mary, and she replies with the Aramaic in John's Gospel, Rabboni, teacher, this moment of recognition and love and wonder, which I think, especially when you're presiding at this altar and you have this very close up, seeing the facial expressions, but the looks between them are very powerful, even as you're breaking the bread and drinking the wine. You've got this very intense encounter with the God who is present, but not physically present, but present here in the broken bread and wine. In fact, it is a powerful experience. But as a moment, I suppose, in Christian theology, it's also really significant. Because it says something about, a bit like the story of so-called doubting Thomas, it's a sort of window into the Christian experience about how we encounter the God who was made flesh, but who is no longer with us. And him saying to her, don't cling on to me, Mary. I am going to, or tell the disciples, I am going to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. A kind of prelude to receiving the Holy Spirit, that each one of us will share this moment of intimacy, but in a way which she doesn't yet understand. Which I think it's one of the most intimate moments in the whole of the Bible, actually, in terms of personal encounter, and of course has been in Christian history and in art has been a source of great fascination. Actually, when you were talking about the National Gallery, I was thinking about during the Second World War. They had these concerts with Myra Hess playing the piano, and they had the opportunity to, British public chose a picture to be brought out of storage. And if I'm right, I've heard this several times, I hope it's true, but the public kept choosing Titian's Noli Tangere, which is, it's sort of fascinating. Why was it that painting which the British public wanted in a time of crisis and spiritual starvation, I suppose, that gave them something. And I think there's something about this encounter which really hits the human experience very powerfully and the religious experience.
It's interesting, actually, because in 1945, Sutherland had actually, when he was asked by Hussey to paint what ended up being the crucifixion, he was actually working on his own copy of El Greco's Agony in the Garden. So it was obviously a theme that people were thinking about. I think one of the things which I really noticed being up close to this work, which I hadn't necessarily thought about before, is the effect of the shadow. And one of the things where when you're dealing with the drama of figures touching or not touching, and this, how important the gesture becomes of Christ's hand, the wrist action, but actually how the harshness of the shadows in this particular work really drive home that distance, that they're not touching because the shadows are so far apart.
It becomes an Isha-like experience.
And you wonder, in a way, actually, of course, the fact that Sutherland, by this point, had moved into doing a lot more portraiture. Of course, we mentioned the hand of Winston Churchill, these studies he'd been doing of hands.
Yeah.
And I guess the other thing is the other arm of Christ,
crazy long arm,
which leads up the banister.
He's been doing Pilates for a long time to get the arm that long. This is very. I mean, some people say that the arm sort of points towards Michelangelo's Adam.
Right.
I don't know whether that is true or not, or whether the correspondence.
I mean, you mentioned the National. Whether we should actually have look at some depictions of.
That's a good idea.
Mary Magdalene, and I guess you're probably in a better place to talk about
the complex
afterlife
of yes. I mean, this is probably the key scene for the Magdalene in the Bible. She's not actually referred to by name on very many occasions. We hear in Luke chapter 8 that she's one of a number of women who accompany Jesus and in his ministry and serve him, and which would mean serving the poor and assisting him in his ministry of healing and teaching. So we presume she might have been quite wealthy to do that, to leave that all behind. We hear tantalizingly that she had 7 demons taken out of her, pushed out of her, presumably by Jesus' own healing. But beyond that, we know that she was present at the resurrection, which does imply a certain degree of intimacy. And I think perhaps that's been a sort of springboard in its own right for one particular trajectory for Mary Magdalene. I mean, we might think of Dan Brown's spectacular literary oeuvre, which has kind of taken up some themes around Mary Magdalene, which arise out of some Gnostic gospels found in Egypt in just after the Second World War, which talk about, or sort of expand upon this intimacy and say that Jesus sort of favoured her above all others, making Peter irritable, and he kissed her on the mouth. This is much later than the Gospels. In fact, there's a Gospel of Mary where she utters cosmic truths. It's all pretty barking and a long way away from the Gospels themselves, but nonetheless has been a sort of source of excitement for Dan Brown and others in the 1970s. But I suppose that the more significant other trajectory, less than page turners in the 21st century, is the way in which she's being conflated with other Marys in the New Testament. And that's, we tend to point to Gregory the Great in particular, who in 591 gives this sermon in San Clemente, where he equates the Magdalene with Mary of Bethany, but also with the woman in chapter 7 of Luke's Gospel, who is a sinner who uses her hair to wipe Jesus's feet with her tears. This beautiful scene of repentance and love. It just precedes the first account of Mary Magdalene, but it's quite clear they're not the same. And that sort of leads into a whole stream of writing, religious devotion, particularly in the south of France, in Vézelay, where Mary is reinterpreted as a prostitute, or someone, a sinner and a penitent, and as a fallen woman, and I guess
this is a prime example. I guess this is a Titian called the Penitent Magdalene. And
she said probably a bit much for a, for a Thursday evening at the cathedral. Yes, no, indeed, no, and that's sort of prime example.
Slightly more appropriate version.
Yeah, indeed. And you do see a bit of that here. I think. I mean, I think I remember presiding for the first time, and it is remarkably. The sensuality is there in the way she's depicted. And in fact, one of my predecessors as Chancellor, Cheslin Jones, who I think is more famous for not liking the piper at evensong, he put on sunglasses yes. to make his point. But he said in a sermon, I've forgotten the phrase, actually, you might remember May West.
It looks like she come up and see me sometime.
Come up and see me sometime, yes. Yeah. So, yes, follow me up
yeah.
to bed rather than to heaven.
And I guess in relation to that, what's quite interesting is also that this work was vandalized
with a biro.
With a biro by a woman who thought it was obscene. I mean, it was quite an extreme reaction to modern art, but on the basis that she was so unsettled by that sense of the relationship. Should we look at a couple of these other art historical depictions, which perhaps I guess Sutherland was thinking about, and so of course. There's quite a lot of this. We'll go through them quite quickly, but Fra Angelico's version from the 15th century in Florence. Sandro Botticelli, also painted in Florence in the late 15th century, in 1484, which is now in Philadelphia. And again, and actually in a way, this depiction by Botticelli in this kind of slightly kind of built urban setting of the enclosed garden, which of course in the Renaissance was a particular idea, the hortus conclusus, and of course the Titian which you referred to in the National Gallery collection. And I think Sutherland specifically spoke about this version, and what's interesting with this version from 1514 thereabouts, X-ray photographs have actually revealed that the figure of Christ originally had a gardener's hat. And of course, the gardener's hat is a key difference between the two versions of this scene that we have in the gallery, which doesn't have the hat, and this version, which does. Others include Agnolo Bronzino in the late 16th century, and Jura, where he really goes for it with the depiction of Christ as the gardener with a spade and hat. And
is she, I mean, because Mary was a sort of great, the depiction of Mary as a fallen woman was a sort of point of great contention in the Reformation. Is she
so I guess this would have been pre-Reformation.
Okay,
I mean, the Bronzino is just on the verge of that. So I guess 1570s.
It was 1570 onwards, yeah.
And this 1560s is from Germany with the hat, and of course she's got the urn of devotion. But I thought also to include a Lavinia Fontana. There's a lot of discussion, of course, about women artists in the Italian Renaissance, of course, with the Artemisia Gentileschi exhibition at the National Gallery. But this is in the Uffizi in Italy, also from the 1580s. And of course, the famous Rembrandt with Christ as the gardener. But I thought what's also quite interesting is that Sutherland had painted his own version of the Weeping Magdalene in 1946, so just a year after that crucifixion. And it's very much, I mean, of course, at this point in time, he was great friends with Francis Bacon, and they would write to each other.
You can definitely see the...
And this sense of anguish and this notion of a kind of anguished, I mean, whether she's fallen or not, it's hard to say. But because Sutherland at this point in time was hugely influenced by Pablo Picasso, and there had been exhibitions in 1945-46 at the Victor and Albert Museum of Picasso.
And Guernica.
Of course, had been shown in Paris in 1937, a few years before the war. And this sense of this anguished female is very, there's a real kind of connection between the works.
Yeah, you do see a sort of glint of that still in her face. It's it's pretty pained.
Yes.
It's a sort of inner pain, but it's not.
And I think again, what Sutherland does also with her extraordinary contorted arm, the awkwardness of her pose and the kind of gathered kind of folds of her dress that kind of add that kind of drama to the scene. But one of the key things I think about the garden is when we look through that arch and look behind, of course, it's tropical plants. Yeah. And this relates in many ways to Sutherland's own life, in that in the post-war years, he moved to the south of France, and in 1955 had bought a villa there. He didn't really like this reading of his work that's about colour and form. He thought it was a rather lazy reading, but it's very easy to make that actually the colours in his work did become brighter and bolder. And I think because he liked painting in the sunshine. And you can see...
And Hussey spent time down there.
Hussey visited, yes, yeah. And in this work, Datura flowers that we have in the collection of Pallant House Gallery, you can actually see the window frame of the villa, which also occurs on the right-hand side of the altarpiece as well. So there are kind of very, very clear connections that this is an autobiographical situation. This is a very particular garden. And as you look through Sutherland's landscapes of the south of France, these extraordinary red skies, these kind of sunsets, and here possibly a corner of the villa. And this is another work in the Pallant House Gallery collection, which was part of the Hussey bequest. But the villa that Hussey and his wife Kathleen moved to had been built by the modernist designer Eileen Gray. And there's a very famous villa on the waterfront that she built. But then a little further up the hill, La Villa Blanche, as it's known, the Villa Temp a Paya. Interestingly, I mean, you can see here that Sutherland in the outdoor studio at that villa in the south of France. And these are some of Eileen Gray's drawings and photographs of the interior. So it's a very radically modernist space. And at the right of this drawing is a staircase. And I think to make it easier, here's a photograph. And it's very apparent that actually, of course, this is the same. I'll show it on the screen. Sutherland was actually painting a particular staircase on the corner of his villa, and so the setting is his own garden. And what is very interesting is how he works this and reworks this. And in the Tate Gallery archive are many of Sutherland's sketchbooks, and So you can see that he starts in sketchbook 17, I think it is, he starts with a kind of frontal view and this suggestion of the figure at the top of the stairs. And as you kind of look through these pages, he's trying to work out different arrangements of figures. And I think this one is particularly interesting, where Christ is at the top of the stairs and Mary Magdalene is kind of halfway up.
Yeah.
And how actually he changes that dynamic in the final work. So actually he's rooted Christ just stepping up from the earth, so to speak. And that, I guess, that the potential of ascension is then there within the work.
The invitation is different, isn't it? It's rather than a command. It's exhibit. I mean, I guess in the Titian too, it is those twisting bodies, which it's a well, perhaps that points back to the spiritual desire, which is at the heart of it, which captures some of the ambivalence and presence and absence, which perhaps standing at the top of the staircase and come on up wouldn't be quite, or stay down, do not touch me, wouldn't convey quite so powerfully.
You also wonder, looking at the wall within this work, whether Sutherland was actually thinking about the setting of this chapel. And one of the things that is very noticeable when you're sat here is the shapes of the stones on the walls, and that does appear in what he's depicted. Interesting, I think, is to compare these two works, and of course, as I mentioned, the version we have in the gallery doesn't have that. There's a slightly different relationship in that Christ is almost closer to Mary Magdalene, but of course there's a much more kind of space in the Pallant House gallery version.
And darker colours too, aren't they?
Yes,
sort of different sort of intensity.
But also to pick up on the point, when I showed the thorn head right at the beginning of the presentation, you made the comment about the colours being similar, and when you look at them side by side, you really wonder whether Hussey and Sutherland had a conversation about this colour scheme, about whether it worked from a distance, because it's so striking, this similarity.
No. And the garden elements. You are taken to the south of France in a sense, aren't you? It's and the warmth which it conveys is really effective. Amazing just to see how similar it was to Sutherland's own property, really. I mean, there've been some sort of reflections about the other aspects of the painting, which we haven't talked about so much, but the bird, is it a bird which is in there?
Yes, it's some form of tropical bird. I'm not quite sure exactly what it is. And of course, it's harder to read it from a distance. So it's actually, it's great to see that from, but I think, as you said, it's been suggested that it's
the eye of God. Or
creates an eye.
It's almost got eyelashes, haven't they? But it is, in relation to this text, actually, I always think back to Eden, and maybe the Michelangelo's arm is a reminder of that. The Bible is bookended by two gardens, and in the first they're rejected, but we hear of Yahweh meeting Adam and Eve in the cool of the evening breeze, and yet here we have a fresh morning where, rather than being kicked out in the flaming fire at the gate of Eden with the cherubim, here is an invitation to I'm going ahead of you. Follow me, even if you cannot touch me. It's a really, having that sort of Provençal garden brings that into relief in a new way for me, certainly.
And I think, also, when you think about, we mentioned before, the other works here with Chagall, who is another artist from the south of France, who was living not so far away at the time, and throughout his life. This sense of colour, bringing colour into a 900-year-old cathedral, is a really it's a very joyous thing, I think, and whether that reflects something of the mood of the 1960s. It
doesn't. For everything I've heard about Walter Hussey, it doesn't seem to reflect his character. I don't know whether that's fair.
One of the things which I'm always fascinated by is also that Hussey commissioned a set of copes from Kerry Richards, the Welsh artist, who was kind of another of the kind of neo-romantic artists associated. And of course, John Piper. And the Kerry Richards are not used so often, but would have been, they're almost like the Matisse, the vestments for the chapel by Matisse in the south of France. And of course, I think Sutherland and Hussey definitely visited that chapel. So, there are all kinds of connections in terms of what he was trying to do here in Chichester with this very kind of international, bold kind of vision.
I mean, amazing connections. I also wonder how much were deans being paid in the 1950s.
Yes. He was obviously extremely good at persuading the friends of the cathedral. He wrote a book called Patron of Art, and he records these various meetings. And one of the things that he says about Sutherland was that he was very kind of diffident, and but he was very good with these kind of committees at persuading them.
Because he came to visit Chapter, didn't he, I think? And I remember reading that in Peter Webster's book. And, and they were sort of won over by him. Obviously, James changed his mind later. Because there's also that sort of detail, I think, remember, that he didn't pay for it. I think his wife had to sort of write to him and say, look, we're working on the tapestry at Coventry, and not we're hard up. You need to pay up.
Yes. I think it sounds like there was always a bit of a history, because there's also with Leonard Bernstein and the Chichester Psalms, the story of never quite sorting out what he would be paid, and I think he ended up getting a fountain pen or something like this, but Hussey didn't get his premiere in Chichester because it was performed in New York. But it seems like a good moment to actually show that portrait. I'm not quite sure whether the kind of camera can actually pick up the memorial tablet that's right in front of us. But this is the portrait of Walter Hussey. It was painted in 1965. It's often described as unfinished, but I think in a way, after 1965, he did no more work on it. So I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think probably as far as Sutherland was concerned, it was finished. And it does show what a remarkable figurative artist he was. This is just 4 years after this. The altarpiece was painted. Yeah,
it is striking, and I suppose that's maybe that's a way to sort of bring to a close. But even if he didn't pay up, or didn't pay probably as much as he should have done for some of these masterpieces, that's the great joy of Chichester, that we have these items both here but also in Pallant.
And perhaps we should actually, since it's also the anniversary of the whole chapel, quickly make a mention of the Geoffrey Clark candlesticks, and in fact the altar rail in front of us. And again, there was quite a strong connection between Sutherland and Geoffrey Clark. Geoffrey Clark being a sculptor and who was also designed the pulpit in the cathedral, of course, and the doors. But in Coventry Cathedral, he had designed a crucifix which sits right underneath the tapestry of Christ in glory. And I do wonder whether the form is so similar to these shapes either side of the crucifixion, whether that was a kind of reference point. And of course, Geoffrey Clark would have seen this in the deanery. And Hussey also had this wonderful piece that we now have at Pallant House Gallery, which is called God as the Centre of Nature, which is a kind of metal relief with a series of figures with a crucifixion at the centre. And the chapel of what was then Bishop Otter College, now the University of Chichester, on the exterior of that, of course, there's a Geoffrey Clark as well. So there's quite a kind of strong relationship between him and the cathedral. And I think the third element of this was Robert Potter, the cathedral architect at the time. And I think that he, in discussions with Hussey, very much felt that it should be one commission for the altar painting, one for the furnishings, and he, as the architect, would design the rest of the setting. And so, Robert Potter was very, very, I think, instrumental in carrying out quite a lot of the kind of the planning within the cathedral for Hussey.
Effectively so, yeah. So I suppose that can be the nightmare of many cathedrals now, that it's all done so painfully by committee, that the freedom which Hussey and Potter had to bring all of this together in its unity is much harder to achieve, and so much more rarely achieved than what we have here, which we've celebrated so fantastically. Certainly, thank you to all your amazing contributions, which I've learned a huge amount. I'm sure many have at home, and there are probably questions which are coming through. Are there?
Yes. So we're just getting the questions that are coming through from home.
Okay. Okay, brilliant. I've got some questions here on the phone. Right. Well, yes, we've sort of explored, yes, how did a clergyman have the means to pay for all of this, from Pat. That's interesting. We haven't mentioned Craxton, but someone's asked about was there a connection between Craxton and Sutherland?
So yes. So the question, was there a connection between John Craxton, the artist, and Graham Sutherland? And yes, there was. And the key connection, well, John Craxton actually went to the Prebendal School in Chichester, and the famous Romanesque reliefs, which are a few meters from where we're currently sitting on, in the South Aisle, he believed had a great impact on him as a child. But during the Second World War, he shared studio premises with Lucian Freud, and they were supported by a collector called Peter Watson, who was part of, during the Second World War, there was Kenneth Clark, who was director of the National Gallery, Hussey, of course, in Northampton. There was a number of these people. Sir Colin Anderson was another collector. But Peter Watson, who had inherited all his money from Margarine and had been in Paris and had collected Picasso and Surrealists, he supported a magazine called Horizon magazine. And this was a magazine which a lot of people during the war, a lot of soldiers read this, but it was a literary magazine which published essays and poems, but also the work of a lot of these artists. It was the first place when exhibitions weren't happening in the same way. And he introduced Sutherland and Craxton. And in fact, Peter Watson, Graham Sutherland, and John Craxton all went to Pembrokeshire together, I think in 1939, when Sutherland painted a famous series of entrances to Elaine, but again in 1943, and I think in 1943 with Craxton. So they knew each other, and I think we're obviously friends.
Yeah.
And I think that notion of the neo-romantic artist, which when looking back to kind of pastoral idyll during wartime, was something they both kind of shared in that view. Craxton was absolutely not a believer. He declared himself to be almost an Athenian. He went off to Greece after the war.
The Paddy Lee Firma book covers,
yeah.
So fantastic, yeah. Well, some of these questions, they are very learned, but they've already anticipated your answers, which you've already given. The question here from Anthony, was the modest size of the painting purely down to the space available, or were there other reasons for this?
That's a really interesting question. I get the feeling that actually when you're sitting here, it's determined by the architectural space, and it sits just beneath that stone lintel.
Yeah.
And of course, when you get further back, there are columns, and so I think he wanted it to be seen in its entirety.
And the Pallant House one is smaller.
It's probably at the same width, but it's not so tall. Okay. But in fact, both works had the same frame. And I guess that's the one thing to say is that Sutherland made a number of different studies, and we saw some of the sketches that he brought down. But he made two final versions, and he brought both of them down in his car. And Hussey writes about this, and they placed both of them in the chapel work out which one. And Graham Sutherland wrote to Hussey the day afterwards saying, I first thought that the best one was the one which we now have in Pallant House Gallery, but now I feel that this one is more appropriate. I have the feeling that he added the hat afterwards, that the hat wasn't differentiating.
We haven't been able to work that out.
Yes, yeah.
No, that was a question about the hat. Whether the hat has a significant identification with the Holy Land. Is it made of straw? I couldn't tell you that.
I mean, it looks like it's made of straw. I mean, I think it's to distinguish him as the gardener. And of course, as we saw in those other Renaissance depictions, it's the easiest shorthand for a gardener that has a kind of art historical context.
Point, yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing is that, and that has been noted, is that the shadow of Christ doesn't have the gardener's hat.
That's right.
But that may be a formal thing about the space, really.
Oh, rather than because of that later edition, rather than anything more symbolic. Fascinating. Luckily, all these questions are for you, Simon, so I'm getting quite an easy time of it. Sutherland's version has in common, this is from Judith, Sutherland's version has in common the 60-degree angle between Christ and the Magdalene, a hint of Christ's return to divine status in the Holy Trinity. Maybe that's a bit more for me. Yes, possibly. I was reading about the different angles because there's a cross there, isn't there, as well, and there's the perpendicular. I mean, in the sense, yes, Judith, he's going back. The Son is returning to the Father, and in John's Gospel, that very much is each one of us is being drawn into God Himself. Those who dwell in Christ dwell in the Father, dwell in the Son, dwell in the Father. So that's perhaps that is indeed sort of brought out by that angle. I've got a completely useless mathematical brain, so even trying to work out what 60 degrees is I find quite challenging, to be honest. So,
I mean, I think one of the things around it is that you find a whole series of triangles. And when you start to look for them, they're in various places. And actually, of course, this is how Sutherland uses the shadow to bring this home. But I mean, so many of these diagonal lines that cut through at various different points. I mean, it would be fascinating at some point to do a complete
just the lines themselves.
Yes, to break it down into lines, because it does have a whole structure that he's working through.
Mathematically challenged people like me,
and myself.
I do see it. Actually, someone has already mentioned the reference to Guernica before you mentioned it. 20 points to Gryffindor. That was from Anthony McNaughton there. Let me see. We might have come to the end of. Have I missed any? Sorry. Here's a good question from Robert. Simon, you've mentioned the existence of correspondence between Sutherland and Hussey, and there are similar letters between Moore and Hussey, which I recall from my own studies. In fact, you had that amazing exhibition last year at the Pallant about Moore's relationship to the reliefs. Yeah. Anyway, to what extent do you think this sort of close, often quite detailed collaboration between artist and patron is common and or rare?
That's a very good question. I think Hussey's relationship as a patron with the artist that he commissioned was both recognizing who was interesting and timely and significant. I mean, he was obviously very ambitious in terms of his aspirations, that he was essentially going to the most famous and upcoming, and he actually helped create their careers as well. And there are letters from Graham Sutherland to Hussey saying how much he feels Hussey was important for the direction of his work, particularly in terms of the religious works. The whole body of religious works that he did wouldn't have happened without him. And I think for Sutherland, receiving the commission to do the crucifixion at St. Matthew's, Northampton, was one of those career-making moments. The other things that I found very interesting was that I think it was a few months before this was painted, Graham Sutherland was actually awarded the OM, the Order of Merit. And rather timely, I think it seems likely that Prince Philip might have been involved with that. And actually the royal family had works by Sutherland, including a painting I discovered of the Queen Mother, which seems so unlikely, but actually when you start to put all of these things together, and I think probably Kenneth Clarke was also a key part of that taste making. But to go back to that question about what makes a good patron, I think it's probably the fact that Hussey gave his artists space. He engaged in a dialogue with them and says, I'd like you to do this. And actually the artist says, actually, I don't want to do that. I want to do, and he then works with this, with the idea, but also tries to get it through a whole series of committees and parishioners. And when you think that in 1940s Northampton, commissioning those kinds of extraordinary works, and actually the crucifixion was in some ways more accepted than the Madonna and Child, because people accepted in 1945 that an image of Christ should depict suffering, that they accepted the suffering in a way that they didn't accept what was, this graven image, the image of the Madonna. By 1961, I think things have moved quite a bit. Coventry Cathedral actually didn't open until 1962, but that sense of modernity was starting to move through. But this was very, very different from what was happening in most other churches. The other, I guess, key figure you might think about is Hans Feibusch, and of course there's Bishop Bell, who was bishop in Chichester until 1955-56. And of course had supported him to do a number of murals in Eastbourne, in Brighton, the Bloomsbury Group in Berwick Church. And so, these ambitious commissions were happening, but of course the figures involved all knew each other. And of course, Bishop Bell was instrumental in Hussey coming here. And beyond that, there weren't so many.
I suppose maybe that's a sort of way to sort of draw to a close, but I mean, there's a question about these sorts of commissions in relation to the church's patron, I suppose, which is particularly striking from Hussey's own life. It's quite hard to think of that confluence of characters being possible now, I suppose. I mean, I don't hang out at the Venice Biennale, perhaps I should, expenses paid. But do you think this sort of commissioning by churches and cathedrals is happening? Is it still possible?
It is possible, but it's harder. And I think one of the things that actually, us serving on the Cathedral's Fabric Advisory Committee, when discussions of this have come up, that question of what is temporary in a 900-year-old cathedral and what is permanent is a really interesting thing to consider. In terms of planning and things like this, and sometimes there are certain cathedrals where things have been commissioned, but on a temporary basis, which of course end up staying for much longer. I think all of these things. How in the contemporary world do we create work that resonates with people's experience? People of faith and people not of faith, actually, and have meaning to all of them. That is a real challenge, I think, for artists. Sutherland wrote texts about on being on religious painting, but I think he felt that that there were both artists of great faith who could create good religious art and not, kind of thing. But I think it probably helps because actually it's about an intensity of emotion and feeling and of focus often, and actually if it doesn't have that, it can be rather formless in the what is the function of the piece.
Just there to shock.
Yes, this is clearly here as an altarpiece, as an object of devotion, and probably we read it in a different way to the one that's in the gallery.
Yes. I think it's just as a final comment, but it sort of relates a bit to the times we've been in this past year, and the cathedral now being open again. This isn't just a ploy to encourage people to come and visit the cathedral. But you know, we've had to clear out so much from the building. So it's interesting that apart from these works, which suddenly come into relief in a new way, I think the building itself as a piece of art for the glory of God, so it comes into relief. I mean, the nave I find absolutely magnificent at the moment, and you do see the building and masterpieces like this in very much a new light. Simon, thank you so much for all your reflections and incredible knowledge about Hussey and about Sutherland, and do encourage you, even if you're not local, to venture towards Chichester and see Noli Tangere in person. It really is incredibly special, and it's been a delight to celebrate its 60th anniversary here today. We look forward to it. Well, we should invite you back for Piper's anniversary in a couple of years, and of course next year will be a big anniversary for Pallant.
Yes, so it's the 40th anniversary of Pallant House Gallery, and of course Chichester's Season of Culture 2022.
Yeah. So, much to look forward to. Well, thank you so much for being with us this evening, and wish you all well.